Hello, and welcome to Unstuck by Nicole, a little perspective in your pocket to help you think differently, lead differently, and live a little more intentionally. Now, have you ever had one of those days where it feels like absolutely everything is working against you? You manage to solve one problem only for another one to appear. And you started your day with a plan, and by lunchtime, you've had to abandon it completely because life has other ideas for you. Now, a few days ago, I had one of those days. I'd been back in the UK visiting family and friends, and I was finally heading home after 3 weeks away from my husband, and I was genuinely excited to get back. The journey involved an international flight, followed by a domestic connection through Atlanta, with what I thought was a very comfortable 2 hour layover. But more for me, it turned out to be anything but. The international flight was delayed. And then once we did finally land, we then sat on the runway for over an hour due to another plane being at our gate. And by the time we finally got to baggage reclaim, my suitcase seemed to be taking the scenic route and was one of the very last to appear. And at that point, I knew I was in trouble. I had just 17 minutes to get from the international terminal to the domestic terminal before bag check closed. Now, if you've ever been through Atlanta Airport, you'll know that's not exactly a quick stroll. The international and domestic terminals require either a taxi or a bus transfer. Now, due to the time restrictions, I opted for a taxi. But the journey between terminals felt painfully slow, and my stress levels were elevating. I was doing the mental maths in my head, trying to figure out, can I make it? And the tears were streaming down my cheeks. I was exhausted. At this time of night, it was already 11:30. I'd been traveling most of the day, and I just wanted to get home to my husband. I kept thinking, if I can just get through security quickly, if the tram comes straight away, and if nothing gets pulled out my bag, maybe, just maybe, it was like my brain was trying to solve problems that hadn't even happened yet. By some miracle, I managed to get to the bag drop desk just in time. I did have to jump the queue, which felt very uncomfortable, but I did it. And now I just needed to get myself through security and to the gate, but with very, very limited time. As I went to security, I usually get to go through TSA pre check, but it had closed, which meant I had to join the standard security queue, which looked absolutely enormous. I asked if there was anything that they could do to help me, and the answer was quite simply no. So, in a complete state of emotional despair, I did something that was very unlike me. I started asking complete strangers if I could move ahead of them in the queue. Honestly, I still can't quite believe I did that. I don't know if it's the British in me, but I would never usually ask to queue jump. And anyone who knows me knows I hate inconvenience people. And I knew that by me jumping ahead, I was delaying them. But in that moment, I was so desperate to get home that that embarrassment just completely disappeared. And do you know what? Most people were incredibly kind. A few weren't, which I completely understood, but the vast majority let me through without hesitation. I eventually made it through security, and at this point, I had literally 3 minutes until my gate was meant to close. I jumped onto the tram, and I had to get through 4 different gate stops before I got to D gates. As I was on the tram, I could see that the gate closure time came and went while I was still traveling between the gates. I remember thinking, just keep going. At least you'll know that you tried. As I got off the tram, a realization that my gate was the furthest one away from where the tram was. I had to sprint. I was exhausted, I was stressed, I was anxious, and my body's adrenaline levels were through the roof. But I just kept going. I finally reached the gate, and there was still a large group of passengers being held. So I had this tiny glimmer of hope. Is there any way I can get on this plane? Now, the lady helping them trying to get onto the flight, I was trying to help them deal with an issue with their tickets, and it took 20 minutes for her to resolve it. Now, once the gate agent finally scanned my boarding pass, she looked at me and said, "I am so sorry. I literally just gave your seat to one of those passengers." And that was it. What surprised me wasn't that I actually had missed my flight. It was what happened next. I actually didn't get angry. I didn't burst into tears. I didn't argue with her. Instead, I just felt myself let go. It wasn't even a conscious decision. It was almost like my mind finally said, "Nicole, you've genuinely done everything that you could." I'd run through the airport. I'd asked strangers for help. I'd stepped well outside my comfort zone by jumping queues. I'd exhausted every option available to me, and there was literally nothing more I could influence. And strangely, that realization wasn't depressing. It was actually incredibly peaceful. Almost immediately, I noticed my breathing slow down, and the dizziness from the adrenaline started to disappear. But what fascinates me most is actually what happened next. I just completely stopped reacting. I wasn't crying anymore. I wasn't feeling hot. I wasn't feeling flustered. Instead, I just began observing. Now, up until that point, the lady behind the check-in desk held quite a lot of power. She was the person standing between me and getting home. But once I took a really deep breath, I could actually see her for who she was. And she wasn't my obstacle. She was simply another human being trying incredibly hard to help a lot of stressed and very frustrated people. Some passengers had become so overwhelmed that they were unable to make the flight, that they were literally kicking their suitcase down the terminal. She remained calm, patient, and empathetic through it all. And I don't think I would have noticed those qualities in her had I stayed in that state I'd been in for the prior 2 hours. Now, as she had mentioned that she gave my seat away to the group that had just boarded the plane, I thought to myself, she might be able to help me figure out how I can get the flight out in the morning. So I waited. I waited for her to escort this last group onto the plane and come back out. 15 minutes went by, and this flight was significantly delayed at this point. But a short while later, the gate door reopened. And to my surprise, not only did she walk back through, but the entire group that I had watched board the aircraft, the ones that she gave my seat away to, also walked back off with her. And it turned out there'd actually only been 6 seats available, not 7. And because they were all travelling together and included minors, they all had to come back off together rather than split up, which meant my seat became available again. I was actually getting on that flight, going home, and being reunited with my husband. Now, I don't actually think that's the most interesting part of the story. The most interesting part to me is that my response didn't actually change the event. The delay still happened, the queues were still there, the seat was still given away. None of that changed. But what changed was me. And because I had changed, my behaviour changed too. I stayed exactly where I needed to be at that desk. Had I stayed stressed and distraught, I genuinely think I would have walked away to the help desk to start trying to solve the problem somewhere else. But because I had waited, I was able to get on the flight. And that reminded me of something that I had learned many years ago when I first moved into the world of behavioural training. And that is E plus R equals O. And that means event plus response equals outcome. Now, an event is something that happens outside of our control, such as running through a terminal in the airport, trying to get onto a flight that you're going to miss, and your seat being given away. That is an event. Our response is how we choose to respond to the event. And the outcome varies depending on the response that we have chosen. If you choose frustration and stress, the outcome becomes heavy. If you choose curiosity and patience, the outcome typically is more resourceful. And whilst we can't always influence the event, we can influence the version of ourselves that responds to it. As I've reflected on this over the last few days, something else has really stood out to me. My nervous system did not know the difference between missing a flight and surviving a threat. It had gone into survival mode. My heart was racing, my breathing had become shallow, I felt dizzy, my attention had narrowed, and everything became about solving the next problem. But the moment I accepted there was nothing more I could do, my body realized it was finally time to feel safe. And that was the state change. And I think that's something many of us experience far more often than we realize. But maybe your version isn't an airport. Maybe it's waiting to hear if you've got the job, or waiting for somebody to reply to a message that you've sent. You could be waiting for medical results, waiting for a promotion, or potentially waiting to have a very difficult conversation. We spend so much energy trying to control outcomes that were never ours to control. And one thing I do want to say, though, because I do think it is important, this isn't about giving up. It's not about deciding whatever happens, happens before you've made the effort. If I'd stayed sitting on the plane thinking, oh, well, if it's meant to be, I'd never have made that flight. If I hadn't run through the airport, if I hadn't asked strangers for help, if I hadn't done everything I reasonably could, I'd never have got home that evening. And there's a huge difference between persistence and attachment. Persistence says, I'm going to do everything within my control. And attachment says, my well-being now depends on this outcome. They are not the same thing. For me, surrender only became possible because I knew I'd left nothing on the table. Personally, I've experienced enough moments like this to believe there's something incredibly powerful about releasing our attachment to an outcome. Whether you see that through the lens of nervous system regulation, surrender, or manifestation, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that once we stop gripping so tightly to what we can't control, we often think more clearly, notice more possibilities, and make better decisions. Sometimes changing your state is surprisingly simple. You could stand up, you could go for a walk, straighten your posture, move to a new environment, take 3 slow breaths, or my personal favorite, listen to an uplifting song. None of those things change the situation, but they can change you. And in my experience, that's often where better outcomes begin. So I'd like to leave you with one question. The next time you find yourself desperately trying to force an outcome, ask yourself, have I genuinely done everything I can? And if the answer is yes, perhaps the next thing to change isn't the situation, perhaps it's the state you're in while facing it. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. If this episode resonated, I'd love it if you shared it with someone who might appreciate it. Until next time, keep a little perspective in your pocket.